Joined now by Labour analyst Loane. A very good morning to you, and thanks again for joining us. Let's lay the foundation quickly. What does it take? What is the procedure when starting up a union, both in terms of being a recognized union by the employer and a registered union?
It's very easy to establish a union. There are certain legal requirements regarding constitution and others, but it's easier in fact to set up a union than it is to set up a company. Simply you need to register, and there are certain requirements for the Department of Labour that you need to meet, but really anybody can start up a trade union in South Africa.
Being recognized by the employer, because there was a certain debate about whether or not AMCU was recognized and whether or not it was a proper, for lack of a better word, union. Now, they were registered in 2001, I believe. The problem then came with the recognition.
Well, this is a big problem in South African law. An employer only has to recognize a trade union if they represent a majority of workers, or if they have a substantially, or if they're substantially representative of the workforce. And that's a big problem, because that favors overwhelmingly large trade unions at the exclusion of small trade unions. So our laws in South Africa regarding trade union recognition are very monopolistic. They favor the big unions, which is why we see such big union federations in South Africa.
Now, what's the future then for the minority unions, for them to break through? Do you think we're going to start seeing smaller unions or splinter unions, especially with the perceived success of AMCU?
No, I think South Africa's landscape will be dominated in the future by large trade unions. There are tremendous economies of scale in operating a trade union, meaning that the union canvassing and other costs that are day-to-day costs for a trade union heavily favor large trade unions. So I don't think we're going to see small trade unions, but ultimately it depends on whether unions represent the workers on the ground. I think that was the interesting claim with AMCU and NUM, that NUM had lost touch with its members. This is a force that's well known to COSATU. COSATU has been complaining about its member unions losing touch with their workers since 1995. So it is a major force. We've seen tens of splinter unions form over the last 5 years, but I don't think they're ever going to be a significant threat in the union movement.
We're now seeing a particular situation in Marikana where the miners have called for their contribution to go to AMCU as opposed to NUM. How possible is that?
No, it won't occur unless the employer recognizes the trade union, and I think employers will be reluctant to recognize those smaller trade unions that are much more radical, because I think employers are afraid that the smaller trade unions are going to influence the general negotiations between management and unions very unfavorably. So I think management will do whatever they can to keep small trade unions out of the game.
Now, do you think there is a risk that the more established unions, such as your NUMs, having lost touch with the people on the ground, do they ever run the risk of eventually having such small numbers of members that they represent that they will one day be overtaken? Or do you think it's just the landscape in South Africa just makes that impossible?
Well, in South Africa, only 1 in 4 workers is unionized. 74% of workers do not belong to trade unions, which is interesting because trade unions give you the impression that the workforce is heavily unionized. There are some sectors where unionization is very high, mining 81%, the public sector 76%, but apart from those two sectors, unionization rates in South Africa are very low, less than 15%. So I don't think we've seen the end of the political clout of trade unions. They speak and have a voice much greater than their membership figures justify. But I think trade unions have had a history of declining membership since the 1980s in South Africa. If we look at the mining sector alone, the decline in employment in mining over the last 25 years from 840,000 to 520,000 represented a loss of union dues of over 200 million rand. So certainly the dynamics within trade unions are very interesting, and I don't think we past of splinter trade unions, conflict between trade unions, tensions in the tripartite alliance. I don't think we've seen the end of that by any means.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. There you have it. That was Labour analyst Loane giving us more insight on trade unions.